Like everything else, Donald Trump wants cars and car parts to be made in the United States.
So we'll effectively be charging a 25% tariff, but if you build your car in the United States, there is no tariff.
As President Trump's tariffs take effect, various industries share, in their own words, the impact on their operations and their bottom lines. As we head out to break, we take a look at the auto industry and how it's being affected by tariff policy.
Now to the growing level of economic uncertainty surrounding the North American auto industry, the big three are navigating a new era as they deal with the impact of President Trump's tariffs.
Now, General Motors and Stellantis are already feeling the impacts, and now we're waiting to hear from Ford. GM says its second quarter profits fell by $1 billion.
He didn't expect this. Not from Canada. Donald Trump walked into this tariff fight thinking he could bend every nation back to his will. But this time, the bluff didn't land. When the White House unveiled its latest plan to demand sweeping auto tariffs across the border, the message was loud and unmistakable: build in America or pay the price. What Trump didn't anticipate was that Canada, long seen as a compliant neighbor, would respond not with panic, but with power. It began quietly, as most Canadian countermoves do. While the American president took to the stage to demand loyalty, issue threats, and boast about bringing car jobs home, Ottawa and Toronto were already holding emergency sessions. Industry leaders, union heads, provincial premiers, all aligned in an almost unheard-of show of unity. Because they knew what Trump didn't. North America's auto industry doesn't stop at Detroit's border. It lives and breathes across the entire Great Lakes Basin, from Windsor to Sarnia, from Oshawa to Michigan, from Ontario's steel corridors to American assembly lines. And when Trump's tariffs went live, the shock didn't hit Canada alone. It ricocheted back into the U.S. economy like a boomerang. In a single week, parts shipments froze, warehouses backed up, and suppliers started reporting massive shortfalls. Ford Motor Company and General Motors both confirmed delays, and the American Auto Association issued a rare warning. A 25% tariff on imported parts from Canada could raise the price of the average U.S.-built car by over $4,000. The administration brushed it off at first. Trump went on air saying that billions are pouring into America. But inside the auto corridor, executives were quietly panicking. In Windsor, a factory manager said, "You can't build a car in North America without parts from both sides." And in Detroit, one senior engineer described it even more bluntly. The border is the assembly line. Within days, that assembly line was breaking down. What began as a show of strength was turning into a test of endurance, and Washington was blinking first. Mark Carney saw it coming. The former Bank of England governor, now Canada's quiet but decisive political strategist, had spent years studying the economics of interdependence. As Trump's trade advisors doubled down, Carney was already mobilizing a domestic response. An industrial protection package, investment credits for Ontario auto innovators, and a new expansion of Canada's Wind West project, aimed at reducing reliance on U.S. energy inputs. He didn't respond to Trump's aggression with anger. He responded with architecture, financial, industrial, and diplomatic. While Trump shouted "America first," Carney was quietly building Canada resilient. The effect was seismic. By mid-summer, Canada had signed new part sourcing agreements with South Korea and the EU, redirecting billions in supply chain contracts that once flowed through U.S. ports. Ottawa's message was clear: we don't need to beg for access. We can build new routes. The tone was calm, but the message cut deep. For the first time in decades, American auto dependency was being exposed on the global stage. Meanwhile, inside the Oval Office, the political mood was boiling. Reports leaked that Trump had demanded the Commerce Department draft a full embargo plan, threatening to raise tariffs on Canadian vehicles to 100%. The logic, according to a senior official, was to break them before they break us. But Canada didn't break. Instead, Ontario Premier Doug Ford called a press conference of his own, standing beside auto workers in Hamilton and declaring, "If the U.S. wants to play hardball, we can shut off the pipelines too." The words hit like a thunderclap. For every car built in Michigan, there's steel, energy, or parts coming from Canada. And Ford's threat wasn't theoretical. Within a week, shipments of Canadian steel began rerouting toward European and Asian buyers, bypassing U.S. markets altogether. Suddenly, U.S. construction firms faced shortages. Prices surged. Governors from Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana began flooding the White House with calls, warning that the tariffs were crippling local industries. It wasn't liberal pundits or foreign governments calling foul. It was Trump's own heartland allies. The irony was unmistakable. The policy meant to bring jobs back was now putting American workers at risk. At a Ford plant in Dearborn, hundreds of employees were sent home early due to supply chain disruptions. A parts manufacturer in Toledo reported 40% production downtime. In Kansas City, a local auto supplier shut its doors after 32 years, citing tariff chaos. For the workers, it wasn't political, it was personal. "We're paying the price for someone else's tweet," one laid-off employee told reporters. Across the border, meanwhile, Ottawa rolled out emergency relief for affected factories, strategy, offered retraining programs, and doubled domestic manufacturing incentives. Mark Carney personally toured Southern Ontario's plants, reassuring workers that Canada won't be bullied into submission. The optics were remarkable. Calm competence versus chaotic confrontation. As the crisis deepened, the global market began to notice. The Canadian dollar stabilized, buoyed by investor confidence in Ottawa's steadiness, while the US dollar wavered amid uncertainty. Wall Street analysts started using a new phrase: tariff fatigue. It described the growing sense that Trump's trade wars were inflicting more pain than profit. Even allies in Tokyo and Seoul began to hesitate. Japan postponed a major investment in Tennessee's EV plant, citing policy unpredictability. South Korea's Hyundai scaled back its North American expansion, quietly shifting resources to Canada, where policy stability and trade access to Europe and Asia now made it more attractive. The dominoes were falling. Trump's demand for dominance was producing the opposite: decentralization. Power was dispersing, away from Washington and toward its neighbors and rivals. By late autumn, the White House narrative had fractured. Trump continued to claim victory in rallies, promising that Canada will come around, but his own advisors were already drafting off-ramps. Inside trade circles, whispers grew louder that the U.S. might temporarily suspend the auto tariffs to reassess domestic impact. The truth was, the impact was already visible everywhere. In Detroit, car inventories piled up. In Houston, energy exports to Canadian refineries plummeted. In Seattle, aluminum and steel importers faced months-long delays. Even the Midwest farmers, who had once cheered the tariff talk, were now seeing their tractors delayed due to parts shortages. The promise of protectionism had become a cycle of paralysis, and at the center of it all stood a single question: what happens when a policy built on leverage loses its leverage? Canada, meanwhile, wasn't waiting for an answer. Under Carney's leadership, the country accelerated its industrial pivot, finalizing partnerships with European auto suppliers, investing in electric vehicle battery hubs, and strengthening ties with Indonesia and Vietnam for rare earth minerals. Ottawa's approach was deliberate: build alternatives before confrontation becomes collapse. It was the same method Carney used during the 2008 financial crisis: steady, data-driven, and quietly effective. And it worked. While U.S. factories slowed, Canadian industrial output actually ticked upward by 1.3% that quarter, driven by non-U.S. trade. The symbolism couldn't have been sharper. Trump had aimed to isolate Canada. Instead, he isolated himself. American credibility in global trade was eroding, and the White House's threats were starting to sound hollow. By the time the next summit came around, Trump's team was under pressure. Governors, automakers, and even Republican donors were urging the administration to find a way out. When Trump met Carney face-to-face at a closed-door bilateral in Washington, cameras captured the tension. Trump, defiant and animated, promised total victory. Carney, composed and concise, simply stated, "Trade works when trust works." The contrast went viral online: a president performing power versus a policymaker practicing it. And for many Americans watching, it was the first time they questioned whether America first was really leaving America last. Behind the scenes, negotiators began drafting a revised framework, one that would quietly scale back the tariffs without publicly admitting defeat. The official line was strategic recalibration, but everyone knew what it meant: retreat. The fallout, however, was already reshaping the continent. Across border towns, trucking companies, parts suppliers, and small manufacturers were recalculating their futures. Some began relocating to Ontario or Quebec to stay within Canada's stable trade orbit. U.S. communities, once thriving on cross-border commerce, were feeling the pinch. In Buffalo, warehouse owners reported a 40% drop in activity. In North Dakota, grain shipments to Canada fell by half due to retaliatory inspections. The message from Ottawa was subtle but firm: if you want access, you play fair. Gone were the days when Canada absorbed every U.S. shock quietly. Now it was writing its own rules. Economists began calling it the Carney Doctrine, the belief that resilience, not rhetoric, defines power in the modern economy. Carney's model was simple: protect domestic industry through diversification, build alliances through credibility, and never mirror the volatility of your opponent. It was, in many ways, the antithesis of Trump's playbook. And for global observers, it offered a striking case study in contrasting leadership styles, one loud, erratic, and combative, the other calm, strategic, and deeply institutional. The world was watching both and drawing conclusions about whose approach actually worked. The truth is clear: tariffs broke trust, and Canada won the game America started. Power built on pride fades fast, but trust always wins. Subscribe to Traveling Vibes for more real stories the world needs to hear.